We all long for happiness. It's the thing we most dream for.
Hail to the altruistic revolution. Let's go for it.
Now the first exercise is just going to get us ready for the big finale.
I was at a cafe recently and a young tradesman came up and he ordered not a double, not a triple, but a quadruple shot espresso coffee. I was worried. Why would a young man in his prime need to start the day with such a blast? And it really got me wondering whether our caffeine culture is actually masking an unsustainable way of living. Time, money and energy, they're commonly named as some vital life resources. And if we focus on energy, which I think is the most important, how skilled are we at managing it? I guess the state of our Earth's energy reserves suggests that as a race, we've got a little bit to learn. But what about our personal energy reserves? You might like to just take a look at this scale here and give yourself a rating. Maybe think about the last 2 months. Where would you put yourself on that scale? Now, this is not a sharing activity, so you can be completely honest. And you might like to make a little note to self. And just in case you're curious about how you compare to national statistics, I'm going to ask you to help illustrate that. So in this section here, could everyone at the end of the row sitting closest to that wall stand up? Similarly, in this section here, can every person at the end of the row stand up? And for the middle section, we'll just take this end here. Can everyone just stand up? And again, don't worry, you don't have to massage anyone or anything like that. You just have to stand up, all the way up the back. Great. So if you can use that standing person as your anchor, then every third person along each row to stand up. So standing person 1, 2, 3. Next person stand up, 2, 3. And we'll see how many positive psychologists it takes to work out 1 and 3. I'll just give you a moment to do that. Doesn't matter if you don't get it perfectly right, but about every third person along the row. How are we going? We're still, I'll give you another little minute. Great. And what I'd like you to do now is to actually look around the room and get a sense of what that proportion feels like, which is hopefully roughly about a third. Because that's the proportion of full-time workers in Australia who say they're not just tired, but they're extremely tired or completely exhausted just about all of the time. Now, that was back in 2010. It was a representative study. And last year, the Australian Sleep Survey, oh, they're all sitting down already. I was going to get you to stand for a bit longer. That's okay. You can sit down if you like. Getting tired. Okay. Of course, I should have known. So last year in 2016, the Australian Health Sleep Survey suggested that things are getting worse, and they found that a similar proportion, about a third, were saying that they were making mistakes at work due to feeling sleepy. Then if we look at full-time working mothers, the proportion who are saying they're extremely tired or completely exhausted rises to about 1 in 2. Now, when you're faced with these statistics, my question for you is what's your response? And which camp do you tend to fall into? Are you more of the feeling, oh gosh, that's really quite alarming, that so many of us are on the brink? Or, honestly, is it more like, well, that's life, what do you reckon? Let's just get on with it. Here's what Michael Lunig's character, Mr. Curly, thinks about tiredness. Mr. Curly thinks that tiredness is one of our most instructive and important feelings, and that we must heed it or else we will not survive. So as a culture, do you think that we heed our tiredness? I mean, Mr. Curly, he's really worried that tiredness is becoming the most suppressed feeling in the world. And by the way, it's not just worn-out adults who are suffering. If you look at teenagers, Australian research shows that about 50% show elevated levels of daytime fatigue. And when we look at primary school-aged children, South Australian research shows that they've been getting about half an hour less sleep over the last decade or so. And when you look at preschoolers, about a third are reporting sleep problems. Now, the really disturbing thing about this last stat is that these overtired but wired children, a small but significant proportion of them are getting misdiagnosed with a behavioural disorder and sent down that treatment pathway, which can involve medication, when actually what those kids need is a good bedtime routine. So I think that in our culture, the everyday variety of tiredness, it's not a big deal, and that allows it to slip under the radar and actually eat away at our well-being in so many different insidious ways. I've only just mentioned one there. What about white-collar fatigue? It's huge, but it doesn't even get named as an issue. So why is it that so many of us are depleted? I guess for every individual, there's going to be a whole range of possible causes. Anything from an underlying health condition, not having enough iron in your diet, perhaps you're just going like a maniac all day, or you're not on track with your life purpose. But if we could just kind of zoom out a bit and take a really big picture perspective for a moment. And I've been really interested for a while now to consider, is there anything we can learn from the planet's energy reserve and how we're managing that, and human energy levels? And I reckon there is something we can learn. And here are 3 common pathways to depletion that I observe. So the first one is ignoring the early warning signs. I mean, how many decades has it taken us to heed climate change scientists' warnings? And then when it comes to human burnout, every sufferer that I've interviewed or worked with, they'll absolutely say they ignored or minimised, some of those early warning signs of just increasing tiredness or that really reactive, racy thinking, or just not feeling as much joy in their life anymore. Second pathway is actually over-relying on non-renewable sources of energy. So what's the most traded commodity in the world? It's oil. And what do you think the second most traded commodity in the world is? It's the coffee bean. So it's like our world is running on non-renewable energy, the adrenaline that we get from coffee, as well as a fair dose of stress, as well as oil. And I don't know about you, but what I find is that the more tired I become, the more attractive the non-renewables become. The caffeine and the sugar. We have a little coffee in the morning to get us going, and we might have a hit of sugar in the afternoon to see us through, and then a good dose of stress to keep us wired all the while. Those non-renewables, they will see you through the days, the weeks, the months, and even the years, but they ultimately borrow from the future. And it's only perhaps years later, when perhaps burnout strikes, that we realise those sources of fuel, they were actually undermining my inherent vitality. They weren't renewing my energy. And then there's the third pathway, and that's a disregard for our limitations. So there is only so much oil in the earth. There is only so much work we can do before we need to rest. And when we disregard our limitations, what that does is it kind of gets us hooked into this momentum that kids us into thinking we can sustain an intense, prolonged output over a period of time without cause for pause or to catch our breath or to strategically renew. And when you look at it, it's like this forever onwards and upwards way of operating. It really mirrors economic growth models that actually run our financial world. And they're actually based on an assumption of infinite capacity and limitless growth. We know that economic growth itself, beyond a certain point, has got a lot to answer for when it comes to environmental degradation. And an economic growth mentality, when it gets inside our brains and applies that idea of infinite capacity to our own energy reserves, then we're in real trouble. And I really think that unchecked, an economic growth mentality, it is leading to another GFC. And for those of you that are interested, Professors Gary Egger and Boyd Swinburne in this little book here, they said it didn't sell terribly well, but I thought it was great. And they really developed that case of how economic growth beyond a certain point not only leads to environmental degradation, but it's also at the root cause of a whole range of chronic diseases, especially where inflammation is involved. So out of those observations fall 3 fairly obvious personal sustainability principles. Listening to our body when it's talking to us rather than waiting till it yells and screams. Increasing our reliance on renewable energy for us humans, for the human body. And then also respecting our physical limitations so we can actually integrate rhythms of renewal. So let's take the first one, listening to our body. In order to be able to do that, we actually need a fair measure of body intelligence, which you could define simply as the ability to connect to our body sensations, to listen, and then respond in a way that's actually going to enhance our quality of life, rather than simply override them. But I think our collective body intelligence is alarmingly low. Like everywhere, every day, we see people working in complete opposition to the design of their bodies. It's like we're taking leave of our senses. You know, out-of-body experiences, we used to think that they were quite an amazing, rare thing. I think we have out-of-body experiences every day. And perhaps you can relate to even being able to minimise or ignore the most basic body signals. Who here can relate to not even letting themselves go to the loo during the day, despite what your body's telling you, because you're just too busy? We're incredibly good at that. Now, an important part of body intelligence is Intero-ceptive awareness. It's something that physiologists actually measure, our ability to notice our internal state. So you might like to reflect on your own IA. How would you rate it? Are you good at actually connecting with how you're feeling inside, or do you tend to minimise or ignore or push away some of the signals? Now, to encourage you to really engage with your IA, I want to issue you the battery challenge. And the battery challenge is this: can you treat your own personal batteries with the same regard as you do for your phone? So let's face it, you know when you see that little red bar on the phone and it says, oh, there's only 10% charge left? What do? You plug it in. And when do you plug it in? Pretty straight away, don't you? You don't say, I'll do it next week when I've got time. So that's the battery challenge. Can you treat your personal batteries with the same immediacy and high regard? So the second one, how can we increase our reliance on renewable sources of energy? And as well as things like sleep and sunlight. Sunlight's good for our batteries as well. We've got these really well-proven practices that we know over time build our inherent energy stores. But guess what? In even the most highly educated populations, guess what happens? Let's take Canberra as an example, because I'm sure in Canberra we've got the highest proportion of highest degrees per capita. Is there anyone here from Canberra? Yay, we have. So what proportion do you think in the ACT, what proportion of people do you think actually eat the recommended serves of vegetables each day? And by the way, how many are we meant to eat per day? So we've all been hearing that message for decades. What proportion do you reckon? Well, it's actually 7%. 93% are not even doing the most basic, consistently promoted nutritional guideline that we've been hearing for decades. What about, that recommendation to move, just moderately, like just a little bit, for 30 minutes a day? And you can even break that up into 3 chunks of 10. What proportion do you think are meeting those recommendations? Well, it is a bit better, 35%. But that does mean that 65% aren't even moving for 30 minutes a day. So we love to blame our tiredness on our workloads and the pace of life, but we're not even doing the basics. And I'm sorry, it doesn't matter how busy you are, you can still eat 5 vegetables a day. Now, the mother of all renewable energy practices, I think, is the power nap. And decades of research has shown time and time again that it only takes 10 minutes of light sleep, stage 1, stage 2, to deliver all of these benefits. And you can get that amount of sleep when you get good at it by lying down for about 20 minutes, about the amount of time it takes to go down the street and get a coffee and come back. And it's because of these kind of benefits that I have become a naptivist. And you can become a naptivist too if you like, and that's someone who engages in activism towards normalising the power nap. And I encourage people like yourselves to nap before you snap, because you can always find a way. But let's imagine you're back in your workplace and it's mid-afternoon, you're feeling a bit droopy, and you just say, oh, I'm off to grab a coffee. What do you think the reaction would be? There probably wouldn't be one, or they might say, oh yeah, can you get me one too? What about if it's mid-afternoon and you say, I'm off to grab a nap? You'd get quite a different reaction, wouldn't you? But let's just pause there. Instead of laughing, let's just ask, why do we treat artificial stimulation with so much acceptance, but when it comes to true rejuvenation, we're actually suspicious. So these are the kind of questions that I think we need to start asking now, like never before. So the third one, in order to integrate rhythms of renewal, we need great respect for our limits. But perhaps you've noticed, though, in Western culture, respecting your limits, it's not something that's promoted very much, probably not regarded as terribly sexy, because we're meant to reach for the stars, never say never, smash all of our limiting beliefs so that we can be everything and do everything we've ever wanted to do. However, as long as we're grounded in this human body, we do have limits that warrant respect. Eat when hungry, rest when tired, say no when too busy. And watch out for resentment, because I think it's a great indicator you've gone over your limits. When we don't respect our limits, illness becomes the only way to stop and take a break. Perhaps some of you have been there. And I'm not being overly dramatic when I say that. So this study here, which followed 12,000 men over 9 years, found that the men who didn't take their holidays regularly were at an increased risk of dying, kaput, carking it, prematurely from a heart attack. If, however, we grant ourselves the opportunity just to put a little dose of rhythm back into our days, look what can happen. So this study here, it was conducted by the Harvard Business Review in conjunction with the Energy Project, 14,000 workers. So when leaders encourage their workers to work more sustainably, and in this case that meant take a break every 1.5 to 2 hours. Look at the results. They're really significant. The increases in engagement and focus and a desire to stay with that company. So it's a really simple gesture, isn't it, for a leader to say, take a break. It's a simple gesture and yet such powerful results. And why is that? And I think it's because when we're treated according to our true nature, which is that we're based on rhythm and cycle, then we flourish. Now, these 3 personal sustainability principles, they're not the whole answer to human energy. There are some macroeconomic factors, for example, that do put the squeeze on our reserves. However, they do form a foundation. They form a basis that you actually can't skirt around or skip over, because the human body is the ground of our being. And in the work that I do in workplaces with well-educated people like yourself, I see people clamouring, for a better EQ, emotional intelligence. They want to raise their IQ. They want to be more creative thinking. They want to be positive. They want to be mindful. But you try being mindful on 4 hours of sleep and 3 espresso coffees. That's a pretty ugly look up there. So returning to that question, are we headed for another GFC? I say yes, and the red lights are blinking. How can we avert an energy crisis? I think it has to start with honesty. So honesty about the true state of play, and honesty about any early warning signs that you might be feeling. And if you want an honest assessment, I really encourage you to ask your body. Don't ask your mind. The body never lies. Now, if it comes back that your energy levels are great at the moment, fantastic. You're the ones with the energy to push back against restless ways. You're the ones that can help champion a collective rhythm that we actually want to live by and breathe by. If, however, when you stop and listen to your body, it delivers the inconvenient truth that you are in fact more depleted than you would care to admit, please don't become a tiredness denier. I'd like you to, take those early warning signs seriously, practice some early intervention, and I've given you a few suggestions on how you might be able to do that. Because if you are feeling tired, you will inevitably face your tiredness. You can do that consciously, or you'll be forced to. So Mr. Curly, he gives us some suggestions on how we can consciously face our tiredness. When Vasco asks, what is worth doing and what is worth having? Mr. Curly says, I would like to say simply this: it is worth doing nothing and having a rest, in spite of all the difficulty it might cause. Learn to curl up and rest and feel your noble tiredness. Learn about it. Make a generous place for it in your life, and enjoyment will surely follow. Now, if after today you want to take his advice seriously and the afternoon slump comes on and you think, oh, I'd really love to curl up for a little nap, but you're a bit worried about what other people might think, you can just tell them that you're sleeping your way to the top. Thank you.